She called it freedom. The ability to walk away, the power to quit, the refusal to settle. It felt like liberation, the thrill of cutting ties, deleting numbers, boarding planes, dropping out, starting over. Each time she left a job, a relationship, a city, she told herself, I'm just being true to my feelings. I don't want to be trapped. I need to be free. It sounded noble. It sounded empowering. It was even admired by friends and romanticized in media. But behind the poetry of movement was a truth she couldn't name. She was running. Not toward something, but away from something. Away from discomfort. Away from responsibility. Away from the self she had not yet claimed. In the modern world, where authenticity is often confused with emotional impulsivity, many people, especially women, have internalized the belief that feeling something deeply is reason enough to act on it. If I'm bored, I leave. If I'm uncomfortable, I disappear. If I'm restless, I must pivot. But Carl Jung warned us the self is not built through reaction, it is built through integration. Through holding the tension of opposites. Through staying, not because it's easy, but because it's meaningful. Through discerning whether what we call freedom is actually individuation, or just avoidance, wearing the mask of liberation. There is a difference between choosing your path and fleeing the one you're on. One is grounded in the self. The other is driven by the fragmented ego. The self, as Jung describes it, is the totality of who we are, the conscious and unconscious, the light and shadow, the impulse and the discipline. The ego, by contrast, is only a fragment usually ruled by fear, reactivity, and emotional narrative. When we make decisions from the ego and call it authenticity, we build lives based on avoidance patterns rather than soul alignment. And then we wonder why freedom feels hollow, why our choices lead not to peace, but to perpetual instability. Why the open road becomes exhausting instead of empowering. Let me tell you a story. She was 32, intelligent, creative, charismatic. In 10 years, she had lived in 5 cities, dated a dozen men, and held 8 different jobs. On paper, she was adventurous. Her Instagram showed cafes in Lisbon, rooftops, in Seoul journal entries from Bali. She spoke the language of transformation. I outgrew that space. It no longer aligned. I needed to follow my intuition. But inside, she was exhausted. Every new beginning required reinvention. Every departure left behind loose ends. Every leap was followed by a crash. She didn't know how to stay. She only knew how to run. It started when she was young. Her father was inconsistent, present, then gone. Her mother was overwhelmed and emotionally volatile. She learned early that safety was internal, not external. That people left promises broke and the only thing she could trust was herself. But trusting herself became synonymous with not depending on anyone, with not committing, with leaving before she could be left. It became the story she told herself, I'm strong because I walk away. I'm free because I don't settle. I'm wise because I follow my feelings. But these feelings were not the voice of the self. They were the echoes of trauma, of a nervous system conditioned to equate discomfort with danger. Jung would say she had not yet begun individuation. She was still fused with the wounded child inside her, projecting her pain into the present and calling it intuition. She hadn't yet learned to discern the difference between fear and inner truth. She hadn't yet confronted her shadow, the parts of her that sabotage, manipulate, withdraw, and collapse when confronted with responsibility. She had confused freedom with detachment and agency with escapism. So, how do we know the difference? How do we distinguish between a soul-led choice and a trauma-driven exit? How do we rebuild a life where freedom doesn't come at the cost of integrity? The first step is honesty. Brutal, unflinching honesty. We must ask ourselves, am I leaving because something deep in me knows I must? Or am I leaving because I don't know how to stay when it's hard? Am I making a sovereign decision, or am I reacting to fear, discomfort, boredom, or egoic craving? The self can sit in discomfort. The self can witness confusion without needing to resolve it immediately. The self can hold multiple truths. The ego demands quick relief, instant resolution, the illusion of control. The second step is context. Jung taught that no action is inherently good or bad, its value depends on where it arises in the psyche. Two people can make the same decision, one from integration, one from dissociation. One can leave a job because her soul is dying. The other can leave because she felt criticized in a meeting. One can end a relationship because she's grown beyond it. The other can end it because she fears true intimacy. Context is everything, and context requires inner work, journaling, therapy, dreams, shadow exploration, projection analysis. Without that inner excavation, we keep cycling through roles, places, partners, believing the next one will finally feel right. But no external situation can give us the integration we refuse to cultivate inside. The third step is discipline. Yes, discipline. A word often demonized in spiritual or artistic circles as too rigid or masculine. But Jung knew that discipline is not the enemy of freedom, it is the container in which freedom finds form. Without structure, desire becomes chaos. Without limits, the soul becomes scattered. Discipline is not about suppressing emotion, it's about guiding it. It's about choosing which inner voices to listen to. It's about saying, I hear you fear. I see you boredom. I welcome you restlessness. But you do not get to drive today. The self is built through choices that serve your highest integration, not your temporary emotional comfort. This doesn't mean staying in toxic situations. It doesn't mean martyrdom or emotional repression. It means knowing yourself well enough to differentiate between what is uncomfortable because it's wrong and what is uncomfortable because it's growing you. Most people leave too soon. They quit the job before they've learned how to lead. They break up before they've learned how to communicate. They move cities before they've learned how to build community. And they call it trusting the process. But the process is not always movement. Sometimes it's stillness. Sometimes the most radical act is staying. Staying in the fire long enough for something to alchemize inside you, not to prove anything, but to become someone. She learned this slowly. After another failed relationship, this one ending not with betrayal, but with an argument about dishes, she didn't pack her bags. She sat, she cried, she journaled, she listened to her dreams. And she saw the pattern every time she felt emotionally exposed, she ran. Every time someone asked her to show up, she vanished. Every time a mirror was held up to her defensiveness, she broke the mirror. It wasn't them. It was her. Not because she was broken, but because she had been building her life around avoiding her own becoming. That night, she didn't text her therapist. She didn't book a flight. She went into the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and whispered, I'm tired of being the girl who runs. That was the moment individuation began, not with fireworks, but with the quiet collapse of a false self. The self who confused feeling everything with knowing everything. The self who confused starting over with transformation. The self who confused freedom with the absence of commitment. And in the silence that followed, something new stirred. Not clarity, not certainty, but capacity. The capacity to sit with life on life's terms. The capacity to stay when staying was medicine. The capacity to leave when leaving was truth. The capacity to discern not just what felt good, but what was good for the self. Because the real question is not, what do I feel? The real question is, what part of me is feeling this? Is it my wound or my wisdom? Is it my shadow or my soul? Is it the ego avoiding discomfort or the self moving into alignment? Jung taught that the path of individuation is not about becoming something new. It is about becoming who you've always been beneath the noise, beneath the pattern, beneath the fear. And that self is not fragile. It is fierce. It is wise. It is responsible. It doesn't abandon its commitments because the mood changed. It doesn't follow every feeling like it's a compass. It listens. It waits. It weighs. And then it acts not from reaction, but from revelation. Modern culture has sold us a myth. That freedom means saying yes to every desire, indulging every emotion, and avoiding anything that feels uncomfortable. That freedom is spaciousness without structure, expression without consequence, desire without delay. But this is not freedom. This is indulgence. And indulgence is not the same as growth. Indulgence keeps us soft in the wrong places. It makes us reactive, impatient, perpetually dissatisfied. It keeps us chasing a version of life that always exists just beyond the horizon. Once I quit, once I leave, once I change again, then I will be happy. But Jung reminded us that true freedom begins not with escape, but with encounter. The encounter with the unconscious, with the forgotten, with the repressed, and most importantly, with responsibility. Responsibility is not a prison. It is the ground upon which freedom becomes real. A person who cannot hold responsibility cannot hold power. A person who collapses every time life gets uncomfortable cannot build a meaningful existence. And yet we are taught that feeling trapped is reason enough to leave. That boredom is a curse. That struggle is a sign of misalignment. But struggle is not misalignment. It is the soil of transformation. No diamond is formed without pressure. No root grows without darkness. No soul matures without conflict. This is why individuation requires the capacity to hold complexity, to understand that two truths can exist at once. I feel uncomfortable in this job, and there is something here I must face. I feel disillusioned in this relationship, and I need to learn how to stay present with my own unmet needs before I blame the other. I feel the urge to flee, and I also feel the whisper that this is where I'm meant to grow. Holding this paradox is not comfortable, but it is sacred. It is the alchemy of becoming. It is what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, and it is one of the most essential practices on the path to psychological wholeness. Let's return to our story. After months of staying not just physically but emotionally, she began to see layers of herself she never knew existed. She realized how much of her identity was built on being admired, not being known. How much of her confidence was actually control. How often she had mistaken the high of novelty for the depth of intimacy. She began to notice how in the past her pattern was always the same: idealize, invest, escape. She would throw herself into new work, new relationships, new cities with intensity, only to sabotage them when reality set in. And every time she told herself, this just wasn't right for me. But now staying gave her the gift of truth. And truth revealed that it was never about the thing, it was about the wound. The wound of chaos, of being raised in environments where nothing was consistent. The wound of rejection, of being emotionally neglected unless she performed. The wound of control, of being praised only when she excelled. These wounds created an internal system that equated stillness with danger, that associated responsibility with shame, that interpreted intimacy as threat. And so she lived her life in motion not because she was free, but because she was haunted. Jung would say she was living from the complex, not the self. A complex is a bundle of memories, emotions, and unconscious associations that live in the psyche like a splintered identity. When a complex is activated, it feels like truth, but it is not. It is reaction masquerading as wisdom. And until we make our complexes conscious, they run our lives. This is why people can be smart, capable, and self-aware, and still sabotage everything meaningful, because they are not living from the self. They are living from the complex. Bringing a complex into consciousness is not an intellectual exercise. It requires feeling the thing we've always avoided, sitting in the fire of shame, fear, inadequacy, helplessness, letting it burn without trying to extinguish it, letting it speak without trying to fix it, letting it soften us not into collapse, but into surrender. This surrender is not weakness, it is strength, because only in surrender do we stop fighting what is, and only then can something new emerge. For her, that surrender came in an argument. Nothing dramatic. Just a moment where her partner said, "You never stay. Every time it gets hard, you emotionally leave." At first she defended, she intellectualized, she cried, then she paused, and she asked herself a radical question. What if I am the one who is afraid of love, not afraid of not having it, but afraid of being seen in it, of being held in it, of being accountable within it? That question shattered her, but it also set her free. Because from that moment on, she stopped building her life around escaping discomfort. She stopped believing that every impulse was truth. She began to pause, to track her body, to ask deeper questions. She began to integrate, and integration is where individuation becomes embodied, not just as a concept, but as a way of life. A life where freedom is not the absence of weight, but the presence of meaning. A life where decisions are made from the self, not from wounded reflexes. A life where discipline is not punishment, but devotion. And in that devotion she began to build. Not perfectly, not without fear, but with presence. She chose work that aligned with her values even when it bored her. She stayed in relationship when old patterns screamed at her to run. She learned that consistency is not the death of creativity, it is the container in which creativity grows. That responsibility is not the end of desire, it is the soil where real desire blooms. That freedom is not about doing what you want. It is about becoming who you are. And who you are is not a flight pattern, not a reaction, not a persona. You are a self, a living, evolving mystery that cannot be known through performance, only through presence. You do not need more space. You need more depth. You do not need more choices. You need more clarity. You do not need to be more free. You need to be more whole. And wholeness is not built in constant motion. It is built in the moments you choose to stay, to witness, to breathe, to trust. So the next time you feel the urge to quit, ask yourself, what am I really trying to escape? Is this choice coming from myself or from the scared part of me that still thinks love is conditional, success is survival, and freedom means never being held accountable? Ask yourself, what if staying here is not failure but initiation? Because sometimes the only way out is in, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is remain. Structure is not the enemy of freedom. It is its foundation. A river without banks is a flood. A body without bones is collapse. A psyche without commitment is fragmentation. This is where so many go wrong on the path of personal growth. They believe that freedom means shedding all rules, all rhythms, all responsibilities. They want to feel free, but feeling is fleeting. Freedom without form becomes chaos. And chaos breeds confusion, self-doubt, emotional volatility. That's not liberation, that's internal anarchy. Jung warned that a life ruled solely by the feeling, functioned by emotion without balance, is prone to disintegration. The self requires structure to emerge. Not external rules necessarily, but inner frameworks, a moral compass, a daily rhythm, a willingness to stay aligned with something greater than momentary comfort. This is what most people lack, not talent, not vision, not intelligence, but interiority, a spiritual spine, a map of the soul. And you don't get that from spontaneous emotion. You get that from conscious construction. So how do you build inner structure? Not by discipline alone. Discipline without meaning becomes rigidity. But by first asking, what kind of life do I want to live, and who do I need to become to live it well? This is not a mood-based question. It is a soul-based one. Because a meaningful life doesn't always feel good. It often feels confronting, stretching, quiet. It demands that we show up even when we don't feel like it. That we hold our word even when no one is watching. That we listen to the part of us that isn't screaming but whispering. For her, this meant waking up without panic. For the first time in years, she set a schedule not because she had to, but because she chose to. She wrote every morning, not when she felt inspired, but when it was time to write. She made agreements with herself and kept them. She stopped ghosting people. She stopped labeling everything that felt hard as toxic. She began to reparent herself, not through affirmations but through action. And slowly she built something she had never had before: trust in her own consistency. This trust changed everything. Because when you trust yourself to stay, not just in relationships or jobs, but in presence, your nervous system begins to settle. You no longer need to control every outcome. You no longer fear discomfort as a death sentence. You no longer seek constant novelty to feel alive. Instead, you begin to notice depth, subtlety, rhythm. Life stops being something you chase and starts being something you meet. And what you meet is the self, the deeper you. Not the one addicted to change, but the one rooted in transformation. There is a difference. Change is external. Transformation is internal. Change can be cosmetic. Transformation is cellular. Change is what happens when you get tired of your own stories. Transformation is what happens when you decide to live a new one. She started to live a new story, not by announcing it, but by becoming it. She no longer needed to broadcast her shifts on social media. She no longer needed to justify her boundaries with lengthy explanations. She stopped leaking energy into performances and started anchoring it into presence. Her joy became quieter but fuller. Her pain became richer but not overwhelming. Her choices were no longer reactive but relational, to life, to purpose, to soul. This was individuation in action, not a dramatic rebrand but a slow, steady deepening. The unraveling of old identities, old scripts, old defenses. The building of new patterns, new responses, new wholeness. She was no longer ruled by feeling, but she wasn't numb either. She was emotionally intelligent, not emotionally impulsive. She learned to let emotions pass through her, not pilot her. To ask, not, what do I feel, but what does this feeling want to teach me? That question saved her life. Because feelings are not facts, but they are feedback. They are messengers from the unconscious. And when we learn to sit with them instead of obey them, they become allies. Anger shows us our boundaries. Sadness shows us what we care about. Fear shows us what we need to hold with tenderness, not avoid. When we run from our feelings, we stay immature. When we collapse into our feelings, we stay overwhelmed. But when we listen to our feelings with discernment, we grow. That is the work. That is the middle path. That is the spiritual maturity our culture desperately lacks: the ability to feel deeply and act wisely, to cry and still show up, to doubt and still choose, to ache and still move forward. Because freedom is not the absence of feeling. It's the ability to feel everything and still remain grounded. And so she became grounded. Not in dogma, not in ideology, but in self. In the silent knowing that said, you don't need to start over again. You need to stay right here, inside this discomfort, inside this decision, inside this responsibility, because this is where you become. Some people hear the word discipline and they flinch. They imagine strict routines, joyless repetition, the death of spontaneity. But that is not discipline. That is rigidity masquerading as control. Real discipline is not a prison. It is a devotion, a sacred agreement with yourself to act in service of who you are becoming, not who you have been. It is the inner structure that holds you steady when your emotions waver. It is the foundation beneath the house of your freedom. Without it, you will build and collapse endlessly. She had collapsed many times. Dreams half pursued, love half given. Ideas never followed through. Her life was full of almosts because she mistook every inner resistance as a sign to stop. She thought, if it doesn't feel right, I shouldn't do it. But Jung warned against confusing the voice of the unconscious with the voice of the self. The unconscious is filled with complexes, fears, habits, and shadows. It will often resist what challenges the status quo. The self, by contrast, guides you through resistance, not away from it. And that means learning to recognize when the very thing you're avoiding is your doorway to evolution. So she stopped waiting to feel ready. She started showing up. At first, this looked like setting small structures, 90 minutes of focused work each morning, moving her body every day without negotiating with her mood, eating with intention, speaking her truth even when her voice trembled. These were not grand gestures. They were quiet acts of loyalty to herself, to her own potential, to a version of her life that didn't collapse under the weight of its own drama. And she began to realize that discipline doesn't kill creativity. It unlocks it, because the mind, when given a container, stops spinning. When given a rhythm, it relaxes. When given boundaries, it blooms. Chaos is romantic only to the emotionally immature, to those who have not yet tasted the richness that comes from consistency. The deep satisfaction of watching something grow, not because you forced it, but because you showed up for it. That's what discipline does. It teaches you how to stay with what you love, and in learning to stay, she also learned to choose. Before, she had confused freedom with having endless options. She chased novelty, kept doors half open, avoided saying no in case something better came along. But freedom is not found in endless possibility. It is found in committed presence. In saying, "This is the life I will build. This is the path I will walk. This is the love I will stand inside, even when it shakes me." Only then does life become real. Only then does freedom become sacred. Carl Jung understood that we are not meant to be everything. We are meant to become ourselves. Individuation is not expansion without end. It is clarification, refinement, the shedding of false selves, the alignment of inner and outer. It is saying, "This is who I am not, because I felt it today, but because I have earned it through conscious engagement with my own soul." This is the opposite of escapism. Escapism whispers, "Run, it's too hard." Individuation says, "Stay. There is gold in this fire." Escapism says, "You've outgrown this." Individuation asks, "Have you integrated it?" Yet escapism romanticizes the beginning. Individuation respects the middle, the messy, slow, unglamorous middle where the real work happens. So she began to honor the middle. The weeks where nothing felt magical, the mornings where her motivation was flat, the conversations that stretched her heart instead of flattering her ego. She stopped chasing peak experiences and started building sustainable ones. She learned that fulfillment is not an emotion, it is a byproduct of integrity, of living in alignment with what you say you value. And that meant doing things that didn't always feel good, but that made her proud. She became proud of herself, not because she was perfect, but because she was responsible. Because she no longer abandoned her purpose every time she got bored. Because she no longer outsourced her stability to new jobs, new people, new environments. Because she built a life that could hold her through every season, not just the high summer of euphoria, but the gray months of uncertainty. And she understood something else, that freedom without responsibility is just avoidance in disguise. That feelings, while sacred, are not sovereign. That the self is not something you discover once and for all, it is something you commit to daily. In your breath, in your boundaries, in your choices, in the way you answer the questions life keeps asking. Will you stay? Will you rise? Will you choose meaning over mood? We live in a world obsessed with the next thing, the next job, the next lover, the next version of ourselves. We scroll through endless advice telling us to follow your heart, listen to your feelings, walk away from anything that doesn't serve you. And sometimes that is truth. Sometimes walking away is the most sacred thing you can do. But other times, many times, it is not walking away that liberates you. It is walking further in, because freedom without depth is just a prettier cage, and depth requires stillness. It requires staying with what is, not because it is perfect, not because it is easy, but because it is yours. Because something in your soul said yes before your emotions had time to argue, and because meaning is not found in escape, it is forged in engagement, in showing up, in holding your ground when every part of you wants to run. This is the paradox of adulthood that no one wants to say out loud. You will not always feel like it. You will doubt yourself. You will question your decisions. You will wake up some days wanting to burn everything down. And still, you stay. Not out of obligation, but out of devotion. Because you have chosen to live a life that doesn't bend at the whim of your moods. Because you are no longer interested in performing freedom, you are here to embody it. And embodiment is messy. It doesn't always feel like progress. It doesn't always look like success, but it is real. It is yours. It is sustainable. Because it was built not on fleeting highs, but on unwavering roots. On showing up for yourself when it was boring, when it was hard, when no one clapped. That's what builds integrity. That's what builds resilience. That's what builds the kind of life you don't need to constantly escape from. Jung believed that the self emerges through confrontation, through shadow, through responsibility, through the sacred act of staying. And when you stay, you begin to see something else, something deeper than freedom. You begin to see peace. Not the peace that comes from things going your way, but the peace that comes from knowing who you are, from trusting your choices, from honoring your path. And in that peace, something incredible happens. You begin to soften not from weakness, but from strength. You begin to allow not from avoidance, but from wisdom. You begin to move not to flee, but to grow. Your decisions no longer scream. They whisper. They don't beg for attention. They move with quiet conviction. And the people around you begin to feel it. Not your image, not your identity, but your presence. This is what she became. Not someone who changed everything, but someone who stayed long enough to change herself, who stopped asking the world to give her permission, who stopped waiting to feel different before she chose differently, who stopped chasing freedom and began living it. And now it's your turn. You reading this, you watching this, you standing at the edge of another decision, ask yourself honestly, is this freedom or is this fear? Am I honoring my path or running from the part of me I refuse to meet? Am I becoming more whole or just more skilled at starting over? What would happen if I stayed not in pain but in presence? What would happen if I let responsibility grow me instead of scare me? What would happen if I stopped confusing what I feel with who I am? Because feelings are important, but they are not in charge. You are. The you that is deep, ancient, sovereign. The you that longs to build something that lasts. Not just something that feels good today. So ask yourself one final question, the one that changed her life. Do I want to feel free? Or do I want to become someone who no longer needs to run? That is the question, and how you answer it will shape the rest of your life.